there is something haunting about the way stone rises from earth. In the years following 1066, Norman castles began appearing across the English countryside like monuments to inevitability itself, great keeps of imported stone, motte and bailey fortifications that watched over villages with an architectural authority the land had never known. Their shadows fell across fields that had been ploughed long before any Norman boot pressed into English soil, across furrows cut by hands that would never read the new charters proclaiming ownership from above. The stone was foreign, the shadow was new, but the fields beneath remained what they had always been. English earth, turned by English labour, yielding harvests according to rhythms older than conquest. Stand in one of those villages in the winter of 1067 or 1068, and you would see the banners. Norman standards snapping in the cold wind where Anglo-Saxon emblems once flew, the dragon of Wessex replaced by the leopards of Normandy, the boar of Harold Godwinson's house erased as though it had never existed. The change of flags announced a transfer of authority so complete that it seemed to rewrite the very air. And yet, if you turned from the castle gates and walked among the cottages, you might feel a strange dissonance. The buildings stood where they had always stood. Smoke rose from the same hearths. Children spoke the same English their grandparents had spoken. The conquest, so absolute in symbol, seemed to dissolve at the threshold of ordinary life. The estates that had once belonged to Harold's supporters were among the first casualties of this new order. Within months of Hastings, lands that had been held by English thegnants for generations were stripped away with brutal efficiency. Norman clerks working by candlelight rewrote centuries of inheritance in an afternoon, reassigning manors to knights who had fought at Senlac Hill, to bishops who had blessed William's invasion, to administrators who spoke no English but now controlled its richest soil. The great families of the Anglo-Saxon nobility, those who had not died in battle, found themselves exiled, dispossessed, or quietly erased from the rolls of power. Some fled to Scotland. Others took service with Scandinavian rulers. A few remained as diminished shadows of their former selves, clinging to reduced holdings while Norman names filled the royal court. The earls vanished first. These were the men who had governed regions, commanded armies, and counselled kings. They disappeared from court records through execution, through exile, through deaths so convenient that later historians would debate whether disease or policy had been more effective. By 1070, the great earldoms that had defined Anglo-Saxon political geography no longer belonged to English hands. The transition happened swiftly enough that one might imagine a sudden catastrophe, a plague of power that swept through one class while leaving all others untouched. The records show a cascade of loss. Morcar of Northumbria imprisoned, Edwin of Mercia dead under suspicious circumstances. The southern earls replaced wholesale by men whose first language was Norman French. New charters flowed from William's scribes like a documentary flood, each one written in Latin and Norman French, each one overwriting earlier Anglo-Saxon land grants as though they had been written in disappearing ink. The old documents, composed in English with their elaborate witness lists and careful descriptions of boundary markers, were declared void or simply ignored. A manor that had been held by the same family since the time of Alfred the Great could be reassigned to a Norman baron in a single sentence of Latin. The legal landscape transformed overnight, remade by parchment and seal, while the physical landscape it described remained stubbornly unchanged. Yet if you were a villager in Sussex in those years, harvesting barley beneath the newly built motte and bailey fortifications that now dominated the horizon, you might have wondered what exactly had been conquered. The Lord's name had changed, everyone knew that. The men who collected rents now spoke French. The armoured knights who occasionally rode through the village were foreign in accent and manner, but the work continued as it always had. The same fields required ploughing. The same crops needed harvesting. The same seasonal rhythms governed life as they had for longer than anyone could remember. The manor court still met, though now a Norman steward presided where an English reeve once sat. The mill still ground grain, though it now enriched a distant Norman abbey instead of a local English monastery. Parish churches still rang their bells according to the same liturgical calendar observed before 1066, calling the faithful to prayer at hours sanctified by centuries of tradition. The calendar of saints' days, the cycle of fasts and feasts, the rhythm of the church year, all these continued unbroken. A Norman priest might now say the Latin Mass, but the prayers ascended from the same stone floors worn smooth by generations of English feet. The churchyard held the same bones. The baptismal font consecrated the same village's children. The architecture of salvation proved more durable than the architecture of kingship. The earls vanished first. These were the men who had governed regions, commanded armies, and counseled kings. They disappeared from court records through execution, through exile, through death so convenient that later historians would debate whether disease or policy had been more effective. By 1070, the great earldoms that had defined Anglo-Saxon political geography no longer belonged to English hands. The transition happened swiftly enough that one might imagine a sudden catastrophe, a plague of power that swept through one class while leaving all others untouched. The records show a cascade of loss. Morcar of Northumbria imprisoned, Edwin of Mercia dead under suspicious circumstances. The southern earls replaced wholesale by men whose first language was Norman French. New charters flowed from William's scribes like a documentary flood, each one written in Latin and Norman French, each one overwriting earlier Anglo-Saxon land grants as though they had been written in disappearing ink. The old documents, composed in English with their elaborate witness lists and careful descriptions of boundary markers, were declared void or simply ignored, a manor that had been held by the same family since the time of Alfred the Great could be reassigned to a Norman baron in a single sentence of Latin. The legal landscape transformed overnight, remade by parchment and seal, while the physical landscape it described remained stubbornly unchanged. This continuity in the countryside, this persistence of ordinary life beneath extraordinary change, created an unsettling paradox for anyone trying to understand what had actually happened in 1066. The chroniclers wrote breathlessly of England reborn under Norman rule, of a new order rising from the ashes of the old. They described William's coronation as a hinge in history, the moment when England ceased to be one thing and became another. And yet, when you looked past the rhetoric and examined the material evidence, the villages, the fields, the parish boundaries, the daily routines of agricultural labor life appeared fundamentally unchanged. How could both things be true? How could a kingdom be simultaneously transformed and continuous, reborn yet the same? The contradiction emerged most sharply when you compared political revolution with social stability. At the level of royal authority, everything had indeed changed. The king was Norman. The court spoke French. The law was issued in Latin. The great offices of state were held by foreigners. The church hierarchy was being systematically replaced with continental bishops. Land ownership had been redistributed on a scale unprecedented in English history. By any political measure, England had undergone a complete transformation, a change of regime so total that it seemed to justify the chronicler's grand pronouncements about rebirth and renewal. And yet royal authority shifted decisively while village routines remained intact. The same courts met in the same places to hear the same kinds of disputes. The same crops were planted in the same fields using the same methods. The same roads connected the same market towns. The same rivers powered the same mills. The conquest had replaced the head but left the body untouched, or so it seemed. This raised troubling questions about what conquest actually meant. If you could change everything at the top while changing almost nothing at the bottom, what did that say about the nature of power? What did it suggest about the relationship between rulers and ruled? Historians confronting this mystery found themselves asking how conquest occurred without societal disintegration. Other invasions in European history had brought collapse. The fall of Rome, the Viking devastation of the 9th century, the Magyar raids that terrorized Eastern Europe. Conquest typically meant destruction, displacement, the unmaking of social orders. Yet England, after 1066, showed little evidence of such trauma. Yes, the Anglo-Saxon nobility was destroyed. Yes, there were rebellions and harsh repressions in the north. But the fundamental structures of English life, the villages, the fields, the parish churches, the local governance, all survived. It was as though conquest had occurred in a parallel reality, transforming the political sphere while leaving the social sphere mysteriously untouched. The Domesday Book, that great monument to Norman administrative ambition, only deepened the mystery. Commissioned by William in 1085, it catalogued land ownership with unprecedented thoroughness: who held what manor, how many ploughs it supported, how many serfs and free men lived there, what it was worth before 1066 and after. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic precision, a snapshot of England's economic landscape, frozen in ink and vellum. And yet it told you almost nothing about how people actually lived. The Domesday Book recorded land but omitted daily life. It counted tenants but captured no speech. It measured value but preserved no memory. Reading it, you learned that Norman lords now possessed what English thegnans once held. But you learned nothing about what English farmers thought of this change, whether they grieved for their former lords or viewed the conquest as merely another distant abstraction of lordship. Norman clerks replaced Anglo-Saxon scribes in royal administration, and with this bureaucratic transition came a narrowing of the documentary record. Before 1066, English scribes had produced charters, chronicles, law codes, and poetry in the vernacular. England was unusual in medieval Europe for conducting so much official business in the native language rather than Latin. After 1066, this tradition ended abruptly. Latin became the language of government, Norman French the language of the court, and English the unwritten speech of those who no longer controlled the machinery of record-keeping. The result was that English voices faded abruptly from written history after the conquest, creating a documentary silence that would echo through centuries. Battles dominated chronicles while continuity went unrecorded, because battles were the language of power and continuity was the experience of the powerless. Norman chroniclers wrote about William's campaigns, about the construction of castles, about rebellions crushed and territories subdued. These were the events that mattered to those who ruled, but they did not write about harvest rhythms that never changed, about village customs that persisted, about the stubborn endurance of English speech among those who worked the land. Such things were beneath the notice of history as the conquerors understood it. And because the conquered no longer controlled the means of recording, their story went unwritten. The silence of the peasantry became the story's most troubling absence. These were the vast majority of England's population: the farmers, the shepherds, the labourers, the people whose daily work sustained the entire society. What did they make of conquest? How did they experience the transition from Anglo-Saxon to Norman rule? Did they feel betrayed by their former lord's defeat? Did they welcome efficient Norman administration? Did they resist in small, unrecorded ways? Or did they simply accept the change with the resignation of those who have learned that lordship is always foreign to those who serve it? The sources offer no answers. The peasantry left behind no letters, no chronicles, no testaments. Their thoughts remain as silent as the soil they worked. This brings us to the question that haunts every attempt to understand 1066, whether England changed rulers or lost its identity. The easy answer is that it changed rulers while preserving identity, that Norman administration governed an essentially English society, creating a hybrid culture that eventually absorbed and transcended conquest. But this answer feels too neat, too comfortable. It erases the violence of dispossession, the trauma of seeing one's lords destroyed, the humiliation of being governed in a language one cannot speak. It assumes continuity at the level of culture, while ignoring rupture at the level of power. And yet the opposite answer, that England lost its identity, That the conquest erased Englishness and replaced it with something Norman contradicts all evidence of linguistic and cultural persistence. The truth seems to lie somewhere between these poles, in some territory that language struggles to map. Perhaps what happened in 1066 was that England discovered it was two countries occupying the same space. A country of power and a country of survival. A country of records and a country of memory. A country that changed and a country that endured. The conquest transformed one while leaving the other mysteriously intact. And future generations would spend centuries trying to reconcile these parallel histories into a single narrative. But standing in that village in 1067, watching Norman banners snap above English fields while the same bells rang the same hours, you would not yet know that these two Englands existed. You would only know that something profound had happened, something that defied easy understanding, a conquest that was and was not a conquest, a transformation that changed everything and nothing, a mystery written in stone and soil. To understand how England could be conquered without collapsing, we must first understand what England was before the Normans arrived. This requires unlearning certain assumptions about pre-conquest England that have accumulated over centuries of historiography. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom that fell at Hastings was not the primitive, chaotic realm that Norman propagandists described to justify conquest. Nor was it the golden age of lost freedom that later Romantic historians imagined. It was something more interesting than either myth, a unified kingdom shaped by centuries of governance, sophisticated in its administrative systems, rich in cultural achievement, yet also fragmented by internal rivalries and vulnerable to the kind of swift political change that William would exploit. Pre-1066 England was revealed as a unified kingdom through evidence written in landscape and law. Since the time of Alfred the Great in the 9th century, and consolidated by his descendants in the 10th, the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had been forged into a single realm. This was no loose confederation, but an actual state with standardized coinage, a common legal system, royal administration that reached into local communities, and a sense of shared identity that transcended older regional boundaries. When Edward the Confessor ruled from Westminster, he governed a kingdom that stretched from the Scottish border to the English Channel, from Wales to the North Sea, a territorial unity that would remain remarkably stable despite political upheavals. Open field agriculture, structured village cooperation, and seasonal rhythm in ways that created powerful bonds of continuity. The characteristic landscape of medieval England was the open field system, vast unfenced fields divided into strips, with each family holding scattered strips throughout the fields. This system required intense coordination. Villagers had to agree on what to plant, when to plow, when to harvest. They shared plowing teams, since few families could afford a full team of oxen. They rotated crops according to communal decisions. The open fields bound people together in networks of obligation and cooperation that made villages resilient, self-regulating communities. These agricultural practices were far older than any particular lord or king, and they would prove far more durable. Market towns anchor local economies across Mercia, Wessex, and Northumbria, creating nodes of exchange that persisted regardless of who ruled from Westminster or Winchester. By 1066, England was dotted with small market towns where farmers brought surplus produce to sell, where craftsmen offered their wares, where traveling merchants connected local trade to wider networks reaching across the Channel to Flanders and France, even to the Mediterranean world beyond. These towns were chartered by kings but existed independently of royal power. They had their own courts, their own regulations, their own sense of corporate identity. A market town survived by serving its hinterland, and as long as that hinterland produced surpluses to trade, the town endured. Geography isolated communities, encouraging cultural persistence in ways that would matter deeply after conquest. England's landscape of valleys, forests, and uplands created natural barriers between regions. A village tucked in a Yorkshire dale might have limited contact with communities just 20 miles away. Before modern transportation, distance meant isolation, and isolation meant that local customs, local dialects, local ways of doing things developed tremendous staying power. The conquest could change who sat in the manor house, but it could not easily change how people in the valley spoke or farmed or organized their communal life. Geography was a kind of cultural armor, protecting local traditions from the homogenizing effects of central authority. Anglo-Saxon kings ruled through consensus rather than absolute command, a fact that would prove crucial to understanding how Norman rule could be imposed on existing systems. The king was powerful. Certainly he could raise armies, levy taxes, issue laws, dispense justice, but his power was constrained by custom and by the need to maintain the support of his magnates. A king who alienated his earls risked rebellion. A king who violated ancient customs risked losing legitimacy. This meant that Anglo-Saxon governance was, in practice, a negotiation between royal authority and aristocratic power, between central directives and local autonomy. The king reigned through a network of noble families whose cooperation he constantly had to cultivate and maintain. Earls governed regions through established administrative systems that had been refined over generations. The great earldoms Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia were not just titles but functioning governmental units. Each earl maintained his own household, his own military force, his own administrative staff. He was responsible for defense, for justice, for collecting royal revenues. In theory, he served at the king's pleasure. In practice, the great earldoms tended to be dominated by particular families who passed power from generation to generation, accumulating their own traditions of governance, their own networks of loyalty, their own sense of independent authority. By 1066, the earldoms were semi-autonomous powers within the kingdom, and this internal fragmentation would prove to be Anglo-Saxon England's fatal weakness. Shire reeves enforced royal authority at the local level, representing the point where central government touched ordinary life. The shire reeve, or sheriff, as the office would later be called, was a royal appointee responsible for a county. He collected taxes, summoned men to military service, presided over the shire court, arrested criminals, and generally served as the king's agent in local affairs. The office itself was Anglo-Saxon in origin, another example of the sophisticated administrative systems that England had developed long before the Normans arrived. The shire reeve was a man caught between worlds, representing royal power to local communities while reporting local concerns back to the king. He made government work at the granular level, where law became lived experience. The Witan advised kings on law, succession, and war, providing a forum where the great men of the realm could make their voices heard. The term Witan simply meant wise men, the council of bishops, earls, and important thegnas who gathered at royal courts to deliberate on matters of state. The Witan was not a parliament in any modern sense. It had no fixed membership, no formal procedures, no constitutional authority, but it represented a principle that kings ruled with counsel, not by whim. When Edward the Confessor died childless in January 1066, it was the Witan that chose Harold Godwinson as the next king. When William claimed the throne 9 months later, he too would seek the Witan's recognition, understanding that legitimacy in England required more than military victory. It required the assent of those who claimed to speak for the realm. Local courts resolved disputes through customary law, creating a legal system that was remarkably decentralized and resilient. Every hundred, a subdivision of a shire, had its court that met regularly to hear cases involving theft, violence, debt, and property disputes. Many manors had their own courts for minor matters. These courts operated according to customary law, unwritten traditions about what was just and fair. Precedents accumulated over generations, procedures that everyone understood because they had been followed since time immemorial. The courts were presided over by local men applying local customs. They were English in language, English in procedure, English in their understanding of law as something rooted in community memory rather than imposed from above. Parish churches served as spiritual and communal centers, offering a geography of faith that would prove more enduring than any political map. By 1066, England was thoroughly Christianized. Its landscape marked by thousands of parish churches, some grand stone structures, others humble wooden buildings, but all serving as the focal point of village life. The parish church was where you were baptized, married, and buried. It was where the community gathered for worship, for festivals, for moments of collective significance. The parish boundaries defined a spiritual territory that often corresponded to older, pre-Christian definitions of community. These boundaries would survive conquest intact, another example of how deeply rooted institutions endured political upheaval. Anglo-Saxon Christianity bound villages into a shared moral framework that transcended local loyalties. Whatever regional differences divided English communities, different dialects, different customs, different historical memories, all were united in the faith. The same Latin Mass was said in Yorkshire and Kent. The same saints were venerated from Cornwall to Northumbria. The same moral teachings about sin and salvation, duty and charity, justice and mercy, shaped how people understood their obligations to each other and to God. This shared Christianity created bonds of identity that conquest could not easily sever, because faith was not something imposed by lords but something lived by communities. Society valued landholding as the foundation of power and status, creating a social hierarchy organized around possession of earth itself. In Anglo-Saxon England, as throughout medieval Europe, land was the ultimate source of wealth and authority. Land produced the food that sustained life. Land could be taxed to fund armies and governments. Land could be granted to reward service or attract loyalty. The great men of the realm were those who held great estates. The unfree peasant was defined by his inability to leave the land he worked. Between these extremes lay a complex gradation of tenures and obligations, all revolving around the central fact of landholding. This meant that when William redistributed land after Hastings, he was not merely enriching his followers, he was remaking the entire social order from the ground up. Customary law felt older and stronger than kingship, representing a kind of authority that did not depend on any particular ruler. Kings came and went, sometimes through natural death, sometimes through violence, but the customs endured. The traditions about how land should be divided among heirs, about what obligations tenants owed to lords, about how disputes should be resolved, these seemed to exist outside of time, part of the natural order of things. People obeyed customary law, not because a king commanded it, but because it was simply how things had always been done. This gave custom a kind of sacred weight, a legitimacy that transcended political authority, and it meant that custom could survive even when the political order that had once enforced it was swept away. Language, law, and faith appeared permanent and unassailable to those living in 1065, the year before catastrophe. If you had asked an Anglo-Saxon Thegnan what defined England, he might have pointed to these three things: the English language, spoken from the Scottish border to the Channel, the English law enforced in courts across the realm, the English church, with its distinctive traditions and its veneration of Anglo-Saxon saints like Cuthbert and Edmund. These seemed as immutable as the landscape itself. Foundations so deep that no political change could shake them. This confidence in permanence would make the events of 1066 all the more shocking and all the more revealing when some of these foundations proved more fragile than others. Yet beneath this apparent stability lay fault lines that would prove fatal. Rivalries among Anglo-Saxon elites weakened centralized leadership just when strong leadership was most needed. The great earls competed for influence and resources. The Godwinson family, which dominated English politics by the 1052s, faced resentment from other noble houses who felt themselves marginalized. Edward the Confessor's long reign had been marked by internal tensions between factions, with the king himself often appearing as a weak figure manipulated by stronger personalities around him. These rivalries meant that when crisis came, when England needed to present a united front, the response was fragmented and uncertain. Regional loyalties outweighed allegiance to distant rulers in ways that made the kingdom less cohesive than it appeared. A Northumbrian thegn might feel little connection to the royal court at Westminster. A West Country lord might have more in common with Welsh princes than with earls from East Anglia. The kingdom was unified in law and administration, but this legal unity sometimes masked deeper cultural and political divisions. People identified with their shires, their regions, their local lords, and only secondarily with the abstract idea of England as a unified realm. This meant that when the ruling dynasty fell, many regions waited to see which way events would turn, rather than rushing to defend a king they barely knew. The ruling class proved more fragile than the society beneath it, a truth that would become devastatingly apparent in the generation after Hastings. The Anglo-Saxon nobility had grown comfortable in their power. Perhaps too comfortable. They had internalized a sense of permanence, assuming that the social order that had endured for generations would continue indefinitely. They had not prepared for the possibility of sudden, total dispossession. When it came, they had no fallback position, no alternative power base, no way to resist except through doomed rebellions. Within 20 years of Hastings, the English nobility that had governed the realm since time immemorial had simply ceased to exist, a replacement so complete that it remains one of the most thorough elite transformations in European history. This world stable yet vulnerable, sophisticated yet fragmented, unified yet divided produced the mystery of 1066. The stability meant that institutions could survive conquest. The vulnerability meant that conquest could happen at all. The sophistication meant that Norman rulers could govern using existing systems. The fragmentation meant that no coordinated resistance could form. When William landed at Pevensey in September 1066, he was not invading a primitive kingdom, but a complex society whose very complexity would enable his conquest. England's strength was its order. England's weakness was that this order depended on a ruling class that could be destroyed in a single battle. And so stability concealed vulnerability, like solid ground hiding a sinkhole, like a foundation waiting for the weight that would finally make it crack. The Battle of Hastings erupted on Senlac Hill on the 14th of October 1066, a date that has echoed through English memory ever since. It was not the largest battle of the medieval period, nor the longest, nor even the bloodiest by later standards, but it was absolutely decisive. One of those rare moments when a single day's fighting determined a kingdom's future. Harold Godwinson's army occupied the high ground, forming a shield wall across the hilltop, a defensive formation that had served Anglo-Saxon warfare for centuries. William's forces attacked uphill all day, Norman cavalry charging against the locked shields of English infantry. The battle swayed back and forth, with the outcome uncertain until late afternoon, when Harold was killed. The sources disagree on exactly how he died. Some say an arrow to the eye, others that he was cut down by knights, but they agree on the consequence. With the king dead and his brothers fallen beside him, the English army broke and fled into the gathering darkness. Harold Godwinson's death ended Anglo-Saxon royal leadership in a single day, severing a genealogical chain that stretched back through centuries. He was the last English king of England, though no one yet knew this for certain. In theory, the Witan could elect another. There were other claimants, other men with some trace of royal blood. Edgar Atheling, a teenage great-nephew of Edward the Confessor, had perhaps the strongest hereditary claim. But Edgar was young, untested, supported by few of the great men who had survived Hastings. More importantly, William now held the battlefield, and, with it, the initiative. In medieval politics, possession often mattered more than right. William had defeated the English army. killed the English king and seized the momentum of events. Everything that followed would flow from this central fact. William of Normandy claimed the English crown through conquest and dynastic claim, weaving together threads of violence and legitimacy into a justification for rule. He insisted that Edward the Confessor had promised him the throne years earlier, that Harold had sworn an oath to support this claim, that his invasion was therefore a rightful recovery of stolen inheritance rather than naked aggression. Whether these claims were true hardly mattered. William had an army and a victory. He had the support of the Pope, who had blessed the invasion as a crusade to reform the English Church. He had the approval of his own Norman nobility, enriched by promises of English land, and he had the demonstrable favor of God, who had granted him victory in battle. In the medieval worldview, success in war was itself a form of proof, a sign that divine providence supported your cause. Norman chroniclers declared England subdued with a breathless triumphalism that served their patrons' interests. They wrote of the invasion as a divinely sanctioned conquest of a realm that had fallen into wickedness under Harold's usurpation. They described William's march through southern England as a series of submissions, with towns and magnates surrendering before his righteous authority. They portrayed the coronation at Westminster on Christmas Day 1066 as the culmination of a foreordained plan, the moment when England was delivered from misrule and restored to proper order. These accounts were propaganda, certainly, but propaganda rooted in genuine belief. The Normans who wrote them saw themselves as agents of reform, bringing continental sophistication to a backward island, imposing proper governance on a realm that had lost its way. English sources describe shock, loss, and uncertainty in terms more muted but perhaps more honest. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that remarkable year-by-year record of English history maintained by monks in various monasteries, recorded the invasion in sparse, anguished prose. Its entries for 1066 convey a sense of catastrophe unfolding, of a world coming apart with terrifying speed. Edward the Confessor's death, Harold's contested succession, the Norwegian invasion in the north, Harold's victory at Stamford Bridge, William's landing, the march south, the battle, the defeat, the coronation, all compressed into a single year of disasters. The chroniclers struggled to make sense of events that seemed to mock the natural order, to violate the assumption that English kings should rule England. The peasantry left no written testimony of the moment, creating a silence that reverberates through every attempt to understand 1066 from below. We do not know how news of Hastings reached ordinary villages, or how long it took, or what people made of it when they heard. Did they mourn Harold's death as a national tragedy? Did they fear retribution from the victorious Normans? Did they hope that the change of rulers might bring tax relief or better governance? Or did they greet the news with the resignation of those who have learned that battles among lords rarely improve the lot of those who labor? The sources offer no answers because the sources did not consider such questions worth recording. History, as written by the literate elite, concerned itself with kings and kingdoms, not with the thoughts of farmers. William ordered land redistribution on an unprecedented scale, transforming England's social landscape more thoroughly than any battle ever could. Within months of his coronation, he began granting English estates to the Norman, Breton, and Flemish knights who had followed him to England. Others secured ongoing loyalty. Still others were strategic placements, putting reliable men in militarily sensitive areas. The process would continue for years, as rebellions gave William excuses to confiscate more land, as new followers arrived seeking fortune, as the piecemeal destruction of the Anglo-Saxon nobility opened up ever more estates for redistribution. By the time the Domesday Survey was conducted in 1085 to 1086, barely 5% of England's landed wealth remained in English hands. The rest had been transferred to foreigners in the most complete elite replacement in English history. Norman lords replaced English earls across the kingdom with systematic thoroughness. William created a new aristocracy built on loyalty to himself rather than on ancient regional power bases. He generally avoided creating new earldoms as powerful as the old ones, preferring to grant land in scattered estates rather than concentrated blocks. This fragmentation of holdings meant that no single Norman magnate could pose the threat to royal authority that the Godwinson family had posed to Edward the Confessor. The new aristocracy was powerful but deliberately kept divided, bound to the crown by grants that could theoretically be revoked, dependent on royal favor in ways that Anglo-Saxon earls had not been. It was a more centralized, more controlled version of aristocratic power feudalism, as William understood it from continental models. Castles rose as tools of surveillance and intimidation, marking the landscape with architectural expressions of Norman authority. Before 1066, England had few castles in the continental sense, fortified stone keeps designed for permanent military occupation. The Normans built them everywhere, first quick motte and bailey structures of earth and timber, later more permanent stone fortifications. These castles served multiple functions. They were military bases from which small garrisons could control surrounding territories. They were administrative centers where Norman lords managed their estates. They were symbols of conquest, visible reminders that a new order had arrived and intended to stay. A castle on the horizon meant that resistance was futile, that Norman power could project force rapidly, that the old freedom to rebel against unpopular rulers was over. The castle was architecture as political statement. Anglo-Saxon elites disappeared from power within one generation, a transition so swift and complete that it still astonishes historians. By 1086, when the Domesday Book was compiled, the transformation was essentially finished. The great families that had dominated English politics for centuries were gone dead, exiled, dispossessed, or reduced to such minor holdings that they no longer mattered. A few English thegnans survived as minor figures in the new order, holding modest estates under Norman lords. A few English women married Norman knights, providing a bridge between old and new elites. But the English nobility as a class had ceased to exist. Their lands were Norman. Their functions were performed by Normans. Their memory was being systematically erased from official records. Within a generation of Hastings, it was as though they had never ruled. Norman law overlaid existing systems rather than replacing them, a crucial distinction that explains much about how England survived conquest. William was a conqueror, but he was also a pragmatist. He understood that England was too large, too complex, too deeply rooted in its own traditions to be governed by imported systems alone. So Norman rule adapted itself to English structures. The shires continued. The hundreds continued. The local courts continued. What changed was the language in which orders were issued, the names of those who issued them, the ultimate source of authority behind them. Norman law did not destroy Anglo-Saxon law so much as subordinate it, creating a layered system where Norman feudal concepts coexisted with English customary traditions, often uncomfortably, sometimes contradictorily, but functionally enough to keep governance working. Conquest reshaped authority, but not everyday labor, because labor answers to seasons and soil rather than to lords. William could grant an estate to a Norman knight, but this did not change when crops needed planting or harvesting. The new lord might impose different rents or services, but the fundamental work remained the same. The land required the same attention it had always required. The animals needed the same care. The village commons still had to be managed collectively. The open fields still demanded cooperation among families. Conquest happened in the realm of politics and power, but agriculture happened in the realm of necessity and tradition. The two realms touched but did not fully intersect, creating space for continuity within change. Villagers remained bound to the same land despite new lords, tied by customs and obligations that transcended individual lordship. A peasant's relationship to land was not primarily a relationship to a lord, but a relationship to the soil itself, maintained through generations of labor, validated by community memory, protected by customary law. When lordship changed hands, the peasant did not suddenly become free to leave. The land still claimed him. His strips in the open field still demanded cultivation. His obligations to the community still bound him. The conquest replaced the person extracting surplus but did not fundamentally alter the structure of extraction. For villagers, this may have felt like a distinction without much difference, a new face on the same exploitation. Contemporary observers assumed England had been transformed entirely because they lacked the historical perspective to see what had been preserved. To Norman chroniclers, the replacement of the entire ruling class constituted total conquest. To English churchmen mourning the fall of their patrons, the catastrophe was complete. Neither group had reason to notice or record the continuities that lay beneath these dramatic surface changes. They did not write about farming practices that persisted, about English speech that continued, about customary laws that survived. Such things were not considered history in the medieval sense. They were simply the unchanging background against which history happened. Norman rulers expected cultural replacement to follow political victory, assuming that conquered peoples naturally adopted the language and customs of their conquerors. This was a reasonable assumption based on continental experience, where conquered territories typically became culturally integrated into the realms that absorbed them. But England proved different. It was too large, too populous, too culturally established to simply be absorbed. The Normans who settled in England found themselves a tiny elite governing a vast English population. They could not impose their language on everyone through sheer force of will. They could not replace English customs with Norman ones when they needed local cooperation to govern effectively. So, instead of England becoming Norman, something more complicated happened, something that would take generations to unfold and centuries to fully understand. English continuity went unnoticed by elites because it happened in realms they rarely entered: the village, the field, the parish church, the local court. Norman lords spent their time at manor houses or castles, at the royal court, in urban centres. They interacted with English peasants primarily through intermediaries, bailiffs, reeves, stewards who managed estates on their behalf. They heard English spoken but did not need to speak it themselves when conducting important business. They saw English villages but understood little about how those villages actually functioned. Their world was the world of lordship, conducted increasingly in Norman French and Latin. They simply did not observe the English world continuing below them, and what they did not observe they could not record. Royal administration changed language but not function, adopting Latin and Norman French as languages of government while keeping Anglo-Saxon structures of governance. Royal writs were now issued in Latin rather than English, but they commanded the same shire reeves to perform the same functions. The Chancery, the royal writing office, now employed Norman clerks, but it maintained the same kinds of records for the same administrative purposes. The royal court might hear cases in French, but it often applied English law to decide them. This linguistic transition created a documentary illusion of complete change while masking institutional continuity. If you read only the official records, you might think England had been remade. But if you looked at what those records actually commanded people to do, you would find remarkable continuity with pre-conquest practice. The kingdom appeared remade from above, and in many ways it was. The king was Norman. The court spoke French. The great landholders were foreign. The castles that dominated the landscape were architectural imports. The highest positions in the church were being filled with continental bishops. England's ruling culture had indeed been revolutionized, transformed in a generation from an English realm into one governed by a Norman French elite. This transformation was real, profound, and lasting. It would reshape England's relationship with continental Europe, pulling the island into closer connection with France, eventually leading to centuries of dynastic conflict over French territories. The conquest from above was genuine and consequential. Yet beneath the surface, England continued unchanged, in ways that would prove equally consequential. The same villages stood in the same places. The same fields yielded the same harvests. The same people spoke the same language in their homes and parishes. The same customs regulated village life. The same parish boundaries defined communities. The same place names marked the landscape. The conquest had changed who ruled, but it had not changed, could not change the fundamental patterns of life that had been established over centuries. Power had been transferred, but culture had endured. And in the long tension between these two facts, power transferred, culture endured, lay the mystery of what England would become, a mystery that would take generations to resolve, and that, in some sense, remains unresolved to this day. In the years following Hastings, Norman rulers made a discovery that would profoundly shape England's future. They relied on Anglo-Saxon systems to govern efficiently because those systems worked remarkably well. William and his successors found themselves inheriting an administrative infrastructure more sophisticated than anything they had known in Normandy. The shire system, the 100 courts, the royal reeves, the taxation mechanisms, the legal procedures, all these pre-existing structures proved invaluable for governing a kingdom much larger than the Norman duchy. Rather than importing continental governance wholesale, the Normans pragmatically adopted English methods, translating them into Latin and Norman French, but maintaining their essential functions. This practical choice to govern through existing systems rather than replacing them would have consequences that the conquerors never anticipated. Shires and hundreds remained intact under new authority, their boundaries unchanged, their courts still meeting, their functions preserved. A shire remained a shire, whether administered by an English earl or a Norman baron. The 100 courts still gathered at its traditional meeting place to hear local disputes. Though now a Norman Lord Steward might preside where an English Thegn once sat, these units of local governance had taken centuries to develop. They represented an intimate knowledge of local geography, local relationships, local needs. They worked because they had evolved organically to match the social reality they governed. The Normans were wise enough to recognize that destroying these structures would have made England ungovernable. Local courts continued adjudicating disputes using older customs, creating a curious legal hybrid where Norman authority enforced English precedent. When two English peasants disputed the boundary between their strips in the open field, the court that heard their case applied customary law rooted in village memory, not imported feudal concepts. When villagers brought forth witnesses to establish a claim, they followed procedures that would have been recognizable to their grandparents. The forms might be changing. Latin increasingly appeared in records. Norman legal vocabulary crept into proceedings, but the substance remained English. Local courts were courts of custom, and custom proved more durable than conquest. English law persisted beneath Norman legal frameworks, like an underground stream flowing beneath new architecture. The Normans introduced elements of feudal law concepts about the relationship between lords and vassals, about military service as a condition of land tenure, about the king as the ultimate source of all jurisdiction. But this Norman legal superstructure rested on foundations of English law that continued to govern most aspects of daily life. Property disputes, inheritance customs, the legal status of different classes of peasants, the obligations of tenants to lords, the rights of communities over common resources. All these continued to be regulated by English legal traditions that stretched back beyond memory. The law, in practice, became bilingual. Feudal concepts for the elite, English custom for everyone else. English remained the dominant spoken language among common people, creating a linguistic divide that would shape English society for centuries. The Norman conquest could not change the fact that the vast majority of England's population spoke English. Peasants in their villages, craftsmen in their workshops, merchants in market towns, parish priests preaching to their flocks, all continued using English because they had no alternative. Few Normans bothered to learn the language of their subjects. French became the language of power and prestige, but English remained the language of daily life, of commerce, of agriculture, of the thousand mundane transactions that constituted most people's existence. This linguistic division created two Englands, an elite realm conducted in French and Latin, and a popular realm that remained thoroughly English. Place names resisted Norman alteration across the countryside, testifying to the depth of English settlement and the persistence of English memory. The Normans might rename their castles or give French names to new settlements, but they could not erase the thousands of English place names that already marked the landscape. These names, containing Old English elements meaning farm, village, hill, valley, river, represented centuries of English occupation and naming. They were embedded in local speech, in land charters, in everyone's everyday references to their surroundings. Attempting to change them would have been as futile as attempting to change the course of rivers. So the landscape remained linguistically English even as it was politically Norman, another layer of continuity beneath the surface of conquest. Farming methods changed little across generations, bound by practical constraints that conquest could not alter. You cannot revolutionize agriculture by decree. The English climate determined when crops could be planted and harvested. The English soil determined what crops would grow. The open field system represented generations of learned experience about how to manage communal agriculture efficiently. The rotation patterns, the distribution of strips, the management of commons, the timing of ploughing and sowing, all these were solutions to practical problems that any agricultural society in medieval England would face. Norman lords might want higher rents, but they still needed their peasants to farm successfully, which meant allowing them to continue farming as they always had. Parish boundaries survived administrative upheaval, their lines drawn by religious geography that preceded conquest and would outlast it. A parish was not just an administrative unit but a spiritual community, defined by the church at its center and the territory from which parishioners came to worship. These boundaries had been established in the centuries when England was being Christianized, often following even older territorial divisions. They represented a sacred geography that everyone understood and accepted. Norman bishops might replace English ones. Norman priests might take over English livings. But the parishes themselves, the actual territorial organization of English Christianity, continued unchanged. Here was another fundamental structure that conquest left untouched. Yet, if you relied solely on written records for your understanding of post-conquest England, you might miss all this continuity, because those records increasingly reflected Norman priorities rather than English realities. The documents that survived, charters, court records, royal writs, chronicles, were created by and for the ruling elite. They recorded what mattered to Norman administrators: land grants, legal disputes over property, rebellions and their suppression, the construction of castles, the allocation of resources. They did not record what mattered to ordinary English people: harvest success, village disputes, the preservation of customary rights, the persistence of English speech and culture. So written records showed dramatic change while lived experience showed remarkable continuity, and historians centuries later would struggle to reconcile these contradictory impressions. Continuity became harder to trace as documentation narrowed. Not because continuity ended, but because it ceased to be recorded. Before 1066, English scribes had produced a rich documentary record in the vernacular: laws, charters, poems, chronicles, homilies. This tradition died after conquest as Latin and French replaced English in official writing. The transition created a documentary gap, a period when English culture continued but left fewer written traces. Later historians, dependent on written sources, would sometimes interpret this silence as absence, assuming that because English voices disappeared from documents, English culture must have disappeared from life. But silence in sources is not the same as silence in reality. It may simply mean that those holding the pens were no longer interested in recording certain kinds of experience. Anglo-Saxon noble families vanished from memory and record with a thoroughness that seems almost deliberate. Within 2 generations of Hastings, it was as though the old English aristocracy had never existed. Norman families now occupied all positions of authority, and they had no interest in preserving the memory of those they had replaced. The great Anglo-Saxon genealogies that had once been carefully maintained were abandoned. The family stories, the legends of noble ancestors, the proud recitations of lineage, all this disappeared as the families themselves were destroyed or assimilated. Later generations of English people would grow up knowing nothing of the aristocracy that had ruled their ancestors, creating a historical amnesia that served the interests of the conquerors. Norman French gained prestige at court and church, becoming the language of power, fashion, and cultural sophistication. To rise in post-conquest England, one needed to speak French. Ambitious English families taught their children French. English men seeking positions in royal administration learned French. English women marrying into Norman families raised their children as French speakers. The language became associated with everything prestigious and powerful, while English was stigmatized as the speech of peasants and the conquered. This linguistic hierarchy would persist for centuries, creating a social division where language marked status more than any other single factor. English survived as a language of labor and home, stubbornly persisting in the realms where power rarely penetrated. In the fields, English farmers called to their oxen in English. In the workshops, English craftsmen taught their apprentices in English. In the market, English traders negotiated in English. At home, English mothers sang to their children in English. The language survived because it was useful, because it was everyone's native tongue, because abandoning it would have meant abandoning the ability to communicate with the vast majority of the population. French might dominate the heights of society, but English filled the valleys where most people lived. Children grew up bilingual across social boundaries, creating a new generation that could navigate between English and Norman worlds. The children of English Thegners who had married Norman lords learned both languages from birth. The children of English servants in Norman households picked up French from their masters while speaking English with their families. Urban children in towns with mixed populations grew comfortable in both languages. This childhood bilingualism, repeated across thousands of families for several generations, slowly knit together what conquest had divided. Language became a bridge rather than a barrier. Though the crossing was always asymmetrical, English speakers learned French to rise, while French speakers rarely bothered to learn English except out of practical necessity. Marriage ties bound Norman elites to English families in unions that were both strategic and inevitably humanizing. Norman lords needed local knowledge, local connections, local legitimacy. Marrying English heiresses provided all three, along with the added benefit of claiming English estates through inheritance rather than pure conquest. These marriages created families where children had Norman fathers and English mothers, where dinner conversation mixed languages, where 2 cultures met in the most intimate domestic space. Over generations, these mixed marriages blurred the line between conqueror and conquered, creating an aristocracy that was technically Norman, but carried English blood and some English cultural memory. Cultural separation weakened quietly over time, not through dramatic reconciliation, but through the simple force of proximity and intermarriage. The conquerors and the conquered lived in the same small island, governed the same territories, worshipped in the same churches, increasingly shared family ties. The fierce distinctions of 1066, when Norman and English seemed like different peoples, gradually softened. Norman lords began to think of themselves as English, defending their England against foreign threats. English families assimilated into the ruling class, acquiring Norman names and French speech, but retaining some sense of English identity. The process was gradual, uneven, sometimes painful, but ultimately inexorable. Norman French began to fade from daily use by the 13th century, a slow retreat that marked the ultimate failure of linguistic conquest. French survived at court and in law, but it was increasingly a learned language rather than a native tongue. The descendants of Norman conquerors now spoke English as their first language, though an English influenced by centuries of French vocabulary and syntax. The language itself bore witness to conquest, thousands of French words embedded in English, especially words relating to law, government, war, and high culture. But the grammar, the structure, the heart of the language remained English. The conquered language had absorbed the conqueror's vocabulary and emerged enriched rather than replaced. A hybrid English identity formed without conscious design, emerging from the lived experience of generations who were neither purely Norman nor purely Anglo-Saxon but something new. This hybrid identity would eventually be called simply English. But it was a different Englishness than had existed before 1066. It combined English language and custom with Norman political structures and continental connections. It was a culture that claimed Anglo-Saxon saints and Norman kings, that wrote in English but kept legal records in Latin, that looked back to Edward the Confessor and forward to French wars. This new identity was not imposed from above or chosen from below, it simply emerged. The inevitable result of two cultures occupying the same space for generations, the moment of irreversible fusion passed unnoticed, as such moments always do. There was no day when England ceased being a conquered Norman realm and became a hybrid English kingdom. No decree announced the transition. No chronicler marked the threshold. But at some point in the 12th or 13th century, the balance tipped. The Norman ruling class became English, even as English acquired Norman elements. French linguistic influence enriched rather than replaced English. Norman political structures merged with Anglo-Saxon legal traditions. The fusion was complete before anyone realized it had happened, and so England absorbed conquest rather than submitting to it, demonstrating a truth that conquerors often learn too late, that occupation is easier than transformation, that you can change who rules without changing what is ruled, that the conquered culture may be more durable than the conqueror's victory. The Normans won at Hastings. They seized the throne. They redistributed the land. They built their castles and imposed their authority. But in the longer contest between Norman power and English persistence, between the concentrated force of political change and the diffuse resistance of cultural continuity, the outcome was more ambiguous than William could have imagined in his moment of triumph. England was conquered but not replaced, transformed but not erased. And from this paradox emerged a kingdom that was both new and ancient, both Norman and English, both the product of 1066 and the heir to centuries that preceded it. The English monarchy remained Norman in origin through the centuries following conquest, tracing its legitimacy back to William's victory and coronation. The Plantagenet kings who succeeded the Norman dynasty were themselves descended from Norman stock through Matilda, William's granddaughter. Even when later dynasties took the throne, Lancasters, Yorks, Tudors, Stuarts, they maintained the fiction of continuity with William's line, understanding that royal legitimacy in England ran through 1066 as through a gate. The monarchy was Norman in its origins, its claims, its genealogical justifications. This fact was never forgotten, never erased, never revised away. It stood as permanent proof that conquest had happened, that England's royal line had been broken and restarted. Political culture briefly aligned with continental Europe during the Norman and Angevin periods, pulling England into the diplomatic and dynastic networks of France. English kings held vast territories in France, Normandy, Aquitaine, Anjou. They married French princesses. They fought French wars. They spent as much time across the Channel as in England. England became part of a cross-Channel realm, culturally and politically oriented toward France in ways it had never been before 1066. This continental orientation shaped everything from artistic styles to political philosophy, from architectural fashion to legal concepts. For about 2 centuries, England looked south and east toward France, rather than north toward Scandinavia, as Anglo-Saxon England had done. Yet England did not become culturally Norman, despite this political alignment with France. The deeper structures of culture, language, custom, law, identity proved resistant to elite influence. While Norman-descended aristocrats governed, the population they governed remained English in speech and custom. While continental architectural styles appeared in castles and cathedrals, village churches retained English forms. While French literature influenced English poets, the stories they told often drew on English themes and English heroes. The cultural exchange was real but asymmetrical. England absorbed influences from France without becoming French, just as it had earlier absorbed influences from Rome without becoming Roman, and from Scandinavia without becoming Scandinavian. Anglo-Saxon elite voices vanished from the historical record with a completeness that creates permanent gaps in our understanding. We will never know what the dispossessed English nobility thought about their fate because they left no chronicles, no memoirs, no letters. The English who accommodated themselves to Norman rule rarely explained their choices in writing. The English who resisted left behind only the Norman accounts of their rebellions, accounts written by their enemies. This erasure of perspective means that the conquest is forever told from the victor's point of view, with the English appearing only as passive objects of Norman action rather than as agents in their own history. Oral traditions failed to enter written history, carrying folk memory that existed parallel to the official record but was never captured by it. Village storytellers surely told tales about the conquest, about lost lords, about the changes that had come to England. Songs and ballads probably commemorated the battles and lamented the losses. But these oral traditions, passed from generation to generation by people who did not write, eventually faded without being recorded. By the time antiquarians began collecting folk traditions in later centuries, the living memory of 1066 had long since dissolved. We can infer that such traditions existed, but we cannot recover them. Their absence is another silence in the historical record, another voice we can never hear. Yet continuity survived without documentation, leaving its traces in the landscape, in language, in customary practices that persisted for centuries. The open-field agriculture that continued across England into the early modern period was recognizably descended from Anglo-Saxon practice. The common law that developed in English courts incorporated Anglo-Saxon legal concepts alongside Norman innovations. The parish system that organized English religious life remained structurally unchanged from before the conquest. English place names marked the map. English folk tales and superstitions persisted in oral culture. These continuities were real and profound, but because they were not dramatic or documentary, they often disappeared from historical consciousness, surviving in practice while being forgotten in memory. Scholars debating England's true origins across centuries found themselves returning repeatedly to the question of what 1066 meant. Was England essentially a medieval creation, born from the fusion of Norman state-building and English society? Or was it an ancient kingdom that survived conquest, maintaining cultural continuity despite political change? The debate was never merely academic, because it touched on fundamental questions of national identity. If England was born in Norman conquest, then English identity was relatively recent, constructed from the merger of different peoples. If England survived Norman conquest, then English identity was ancient, rooted in pre-conquest culture. Both narratives had political implications, both found their champions, and neither could be definitively proven. Some historians emphasized Norman state formation, seeing in William's administrative reforms and feudal structures the creation of medieval England. They pointed to the Domesday Book as the founding document of English government, to the castle network as the skeleton of royal authority, to the replacement of the entire aristocracy as proof of fundamental transformation. In this narrative, the England that eventually emerged was new in 1066. Created by Norman efficiency and continental legal concepts. The Anglo-Saxon past was preparation or prehistory, but not essence. Real England, England as a unified, effectively governed state, began with William. Other historians argued for Anglo-Saxon cultural dominance, seeing the survival of English language and law as proof that conquest was superficial. They noted that England remained English in speech, that its legal system retained Anglo-Saxon elements, that its local governance continued pre-conquest patterns, that its parish system and village structures were unchanged. In this narrative, the Norman conquest was an elite affair, replacing the ruling class, but leaving the culture fundamentally intact. The Anglo-Saxon foundation was so deep that Norman rule merely flowed over it, like water over stone, changing the surface, but not the substance. England remained itself despite conquest. Fusion theories attempted to reconcile both narratives, arguing that England after 1066 was neither Norman nor Anglo-Saxon but a genuine hybrid. These historians saw value in both perspectives, acknowledging that political transformation was real while cultural continuity was also real. They emphasized the ways that Norman and English elements merged over time, creating something new that was not simply one culture imposing itself on another, but both cultures transforming each other through contact and intermarriage. In this view, the England that emerged by the late Middle Ages was a synthesis, genuinely new and genuinely rooted in both traditions. No theory captured the full lived experience of the conquest and its aftermath. Each framework illuminated certain aspects while obscuring others. The Norman state formation narrative explained administrative change but struggled with cultural continuity. The Anglo-Saxon survival narrative explained linguistic and legal persistence but minimized the trauma of elite destruction. Fusion theories acknowledged complexity but sometimes became so nuanced that they lost explanatory power. The truth remained stubbornly resistant to neat categorization, as truth often does when it involves millions of individual experiences accumulated across generations. Absence shaped national memory as much as presence, creating a story full of silences and gaps. The absent voice of the English peasantry, the absent chronicles of the dispossessed nobility, the absent oral traditions that faded before being recorded, the absent explanations for why some things changed while others endured. These absences were not neutral, they shaped how later generations understood their history. The loudest voices in the record were Norman voices, and so Norman perspectives dominated historical understanding for centuries. Only gradually did historians learn to read silences, to infer continuity from indirect evidence, to understand that absence of documentation was not absence of experience. England's identity remained contested and layered. Built up like sediment, each era depositing its own understanding of what England was and how it came to be. Medieval chroniclers told one story. Tudor historians told another. 19th century nationalists told a third. Each generation found in 1066 a mirror for its own concerns about identity, continuity, and change. Was England conquered or resilient? Norman or Anglo-Saxon? Born in 1066 or surviving through it? The questions never fully resolved because they touched on matters that could not be resolved, questions about essence and identity that resist definitive answers. This layered, contested identity became itself a defining feature of Englishness. Unlike nations that could point to a clear founding moment or a single mythic origin, England had to accommodate the paradox of conquest and continuity. It had to hold in tension the fact that its monarchy was imposed by foreign conquest while its culture survived from before that conquest. It had to acknowledge that its aristocracy was once Norman while its common people were always English. It had to recognize that its language was English in grammar but French in much of its vocabulary. These tensions and paradoxes, rather than being problems to solve, became part of what England was, a nation defined as much by what it had absorbed as by what it had always been. And so the aftermath of 1066 was not a simple story of conquest or survival, but a complex tale of both, unfolding across centuries, never quite resolved. The monarchy remained Norman, The culture remained English. The fusion created something new. All these statements are true, and all are incomplete. England emerged from the conquest, transformed and continuous, foreign and familiar, new and ancient. It carried forward both Norman structures and Anglo-Saxon foundations, both the memory of defeat and the pride of survival, both the historical fact of conquest and the cultural reality of persistence. And this doubleness, this both and rather than either or, became the hidden foundation on which England built its future. Norman castles still overlook fields worked since Anglo-Saxon times, their weathered stones gazing down on earth that has been turned for more than a millennium. Stand beneath one of these castles now, Warwick, perhaps, or Arundel, or Durham, and you can see both histories at once. Above, the aggressive geometry of military architecture, stone imported or quarried, walls built to intimidate and control, battlements designed to project power across territory claimed by conquest. Below, the soft contours of ancient fields, their boundaries marked by hedgerows that may follow property divisions older than written records. Soil, enriched by centuries of agricultural labor that began long before 1066, and continues, in some form. To this day, the castle speaks of violent change. The fields speak of patient continuity. Both are England. The juxtaposition is not accidental. William's castle builders chose their sites strategically, placing fortifications where they could command roads, rivers, settlements, the crucial points of England's human geography. But that very geography was already ancient when the Normans arrived, shaped by Roman roads and Anglo-Saxon estates and patterns of settlement that stretched back into prehistory. The Normans inserted their architecture into a landscape already thick with human meaning, and the meaning persisted alongside the insertion. Power built its monuments in stone. Culture made its marks in the living earth. Both endured, and their coexistence became the permanent condition of England. This coexistence reflects a fundamental truth about how power records itself while culture lives quietly. Power is dramatic, visible, documented. It builds castles, fights, battles, issues, laws, creates written records. Power makes noise, and historians hear that noise echoing across centuries. But culture is patient, ordinary, often silent. It speaks languages that leave few written traces. It preserves customs through practice rather than documentation. It lives in the habits of daily life that seem too obvious to record. Culture is the water in which people swim, so familiar that they rarely think to describe it. And so culture persists while being invisible to the mechanisms that record history. The historical record, therefore, systematically favors power over culture, event over continuity, change over persistence. This bias is not a flaw but an inevitable consequence of how history gets written. Those with power have the resources to create records. Those who experience dramatic events find those events worth recording. Changes are noticed and documented. Continuities are assumed and ignored. The result is that we know vastly more about battles than about harvests, more about the replacement of elites than about the persistence of peasant communities, more about legal innovations than about customary practices that continued unchanged. History remembers what power found memorable, and power mostly found itself memorable. So history remembers kings more easily than farmers, which means that our understanding of the past is fundamentally skewed toward those who ruled rather than those who lived under rule. We know the names of Norman lords who received English estates, but we rarely know the names of the English peasants who worked those estates. We have genealogies of aristocratic families, but no genealogies of village families. We can trace the descent of manors through various lordships, but we cannot trace the lives of those who actually farmed the manorial lands. The sources create an asymmetry of knowledge that mirrors the asymmetry of power. The rulers are visible, the ruled are anonymous. Yet if we judge societies by their ability to endure rather than by their ability to conquer, The anonymous farmers prove more historically significant than the famous kings. Kings came and went: Anglo-Saxon, Norman, Plantagenet, Tudor, Stuart, each dynasty eventually giving way to the next. But the farmers remained, generation after generation, working the same fields, preserving the same essential knowledge about soil and season, maintaining the human connection to English earth that was older than any dynasty and would outlast them all. The conquest destroyed the Anglo-Saxon ruling class, but could not destroy the Anglo-Saxon connection to the land, because that connection was not something that could be granted or taken away by political authority. It simply was, rooted in centuries of labor and life. This reveals that endurance proved stronger than conquest in ways that conquest could not anticipate. William won decisively at Hastings. He seized the throne and held it. He redistributed England's wealth to reward his followers. He imposed his will on a conquered kingdom. By every measure of political success, his conquest was complete and permanent. And yet, in the longer view, what endured from Anglo-Saxon England, the language, the law, the customs, the culture, proved more durable than what Norman conquest imposed. Norman French faded. Norman aristocratic families merged into English identity. Norman political innovations were gradually absorbed into English traditions. The conquest was real, but so was the survival. In the end, England absorbed the Normans rather than being absorbed by them. This absorption raises profound questions about what conquest means, about whether political victory can ever be complete when cultural identity persists. The Normans conquered England in the sense that they seized power, redistributed resources, and imposed their authority. But did they conquer Englishness? Did they conquer the English language spoken in village and field? Did they conquer the sense of connection to place, to land, to a history that stretched back before their arrival? In these realms, conquest proved incomplete or impossible. Culture has its own durability, its own ways of surviving, its own forms of resistance that operate below the level of political struggle. And so we return to the image with which we began. Norman castles overlooking unchanged fields, power above and culture below, dramatic transformation coexisting with quiet continuity. This image holds the mystery of 1066 inches perfect balance. Both things happened, both things were real. England was conquered. England survived. The contradiction is not a problem to solve, but a paradox to accept. A both, and that resists reduction to either or. The conquest was genuine, the blood spilled at Hastings was real, the dispossession of the English nobility was complete, the transformation of the ruling class was total, but the survival was also genuine. The English language persisted, the English customs endured, the English connection to the land remained unbroken. Between these two truths, conquest and survival, transformation and continuity, lies the space where we must locate England's foundation. Not in William's victory alone, nor in Anglo-Saxon resistance alone, but in the tension between them. Not in the castles alone, nor in the fields alone, but in their coexistence. Not in the documented history of power alone, nor in the undocumented history of ordinary life alone, but in the way these two histories touch and diverge, merge and separate. Across the centuries following 1066, England learned, though it could not articulate the lesson clearly, that its true foundation was not built in victory at Hastings. The foundation was not William's coronation, not the Domesday Book, not the network of castles spreading across the realm. These were important. Certainly they shaped governance, structured society, created the framework within which medieval England would develop. But they were not the foundation in the deepest sense. They were the visible architecture, the political superstructure, the documented events that historians could record and analyze. The foundation lay elsewhere, deeper, older, more difficult to see. England's true foundation was built in survival beneath conquest, in the choices of farmers who kept working their fields under new lords. of villagers who maintained their customs despite new rulers, of families who passed down the English language to their children even when French dominated the court, of communities that preserved their sense of place and identity through generations of foreign rule. This foundation was built collectively, anonymously, without planning or conscious design. It was built in thousands of small acts of cultural persistence, in the million ordinary decisions to keep doing things the way they had always been done. It was built in the quiet determination of those who had no power to resist conquest, but who had the deeper power to preserve identity. This foundation was not heroic in the traditional sense. There were no great battles fought in its defense, no dramatic last stands, no martyrs celebrated in chronicles. It was built in the unheroic persistence of ordinary life, in the stubborn continuity of agriculture and custom and speech. It was built by people whose names we will never know, whose thoughts were never recorded, whose contributions to history went unnoticed because they consisted of not changing rather than changing. And yet this foundation proved more durable than stone, more lasting than conquest, more permanent than political authority. Somewhere between the kings who ruled and the people who remained, somewhere in the space where power and culture met but did not merge, somewhere in the tension between documented change and undocumented continuity, England was made. Not in a single moment or a single event, not at Hastings or Westminster, not in victory or defeat, but gradually, collectively, across generations that lived through conquest and emerged on the far side of it, still recognizably themselves. This England, the England that survived, was the true heir to both Anglo-Saxon past and Norman victory, refusing to be simply one or the other. And this is the mystery that 1066 bequeaths to us. Not a simple story of conquest or survival, but a complex tale of both, a paradox that cannot be resolved because it is not meant to be resolved. The castles still stand on their hills, the fields still spread below, power still records victories, culture still lives quietly, and England still carries both histories within itself, still negotiates between conquest and continuity, still builds on foundations that were laid in the moment when everything changed and nothing changed, when a kingdom fell and a people endured, when history took a sharp turn while somehow remaining on its ancient course. The question remains unanswered, as perhaps it must. What is England? Is it the nation created by Norman conquest, or the culture that survived Norman conquest? Is it defined by the moment of rupture, or by the continuity across rupture? Is it the product of 1066, or the survivor of 1066? We ask these questions still, 9.5 centuries later, because the conquest created a nation that cannot fully explain itself, that carries its own mystery at its heart. And standing beneath those Norman castles, looking out across those ancient fields, we glimpse the outline of an answer that can never be fully articulated. That England is both, that it was made in the tension between change and continuity, that its foundation was built neither in victory nor in defeat, but in the long, patient, undocumented survival of a people who learned that endurance is its own kind of triumph. The shadows still fall, the earth still turns, and somewhere in that perpetual meeting of stone and soil, the mystery endures.